The hammer came down with a force that would have shattered lesser iron, but the horseshoe beneath it bent perfectly to Margaret Flynn's will, sparks cascading across her leather apron like falling stars in the harsh Arizona sunlight of 1878. She had been working the forge since dawn broke over Prescott, and now at midday, sweat traced clean lines down her soot-dusted face while her arms, muscled and sure from years of swinging that hammer, never faltered in their rhythm. Her father had been the town's blacksmith until consumption took him 2 winters past, and though half the folks in town had expected her to sell the business and find herself a husband to provide for her, Margaret had instead gripped that hammer tighter and proved she could swing it just as true as any man. The cowboy had been watching her for near about 20 minutes from across the dusty street, his hat pulled low against the glare, his horse's reins loose in his calloused hands. James McCarran had ridden into Prescott 3 days prior with a cattle drive that had come up from Texas, planning to stay only long enough to collect his pay and move on to the next job. But something about the woman in the smithy had stopped him cold. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was, with her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes the color of storm clouds. It was the way she moved, the absolute certainty in every gesture, the way she needed no one to steady the anvil or pump the bellows or tell her when the metal had reached the right heat. She was entirely self-sufficient, and that fascinated him in a way he could not quite name. "You planning to stand there all day, or you got business?" Margaret called out without looking up from her work, and James felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the forge. He crossed the street, his spurs chinking softly against the hard-packed earth. "My horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. I've been making do, but he needs proper shoeing before I head out." Margaret finally looked up at him then, and her eyes were sharp and assessing. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to examine his horse, running her palm down the animal's leg with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the force she had been using on the metal moments before. The horse, a rangy bay gelding, stood quiet under her touch. "You have been riding him on 3 shoes for 5 miles, she asked, and there was disapproval in her voice. "That's a good way to lame a horse." "I know it," James said, and he had the grace to look ashamed. "Nearest smithy was here. I came as quick as I could without pushing him too hard." Margaret made a noncommittal sound and lifted the horse's hoof, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had been doing this work since she was tall enough to reach the anvil standing on a crate. "No damage done, but it was close. I can have him shod within the hour." "It will be $2 for all 4 shoes, seeing as the others are worn enough they will need replacing soon anyway." "That is fair," James said, though it would take a decent portion of his pay from the drive. He watched as she led his horse into the smithy, noting the way the animal followed her without resistance, as if he trusted her immediately. James knew horses were good judges of character. She tied the bay to a post inside the shop and began gathering her tools. James found himself unable to leave, though there was no reason for him to stay. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she worked. Margaret seemed to forget he was there entirely once she started, her focus narrowing to the task at hand. She heated the iron in the forge until it glowed orange-red, then shaped it with swift, sure strikes of her hammer. The sound rang out like a bell, echoing off the adobe walls of the surrounding buildings. "You learned this from your father?" James asked after a while, more to fill the silence than because he needed to know. "I did," Margaret said, not pausing in her work. "He taught me everything, said there was no reason a woman could not do the work if she had the strength and the will for it. He sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." There was a note of finality in her voice that told James the subject was closed, so he let the silence settle between them again, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. There was something peaceful about watching her work, about the rhythm of the hammer and the hiss of hot metal meeting water when she quenched it. By the time she had finished fitting all 4 shoes, the sun had moved considerably across the sky. Margaret straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back, and James saw the first sign that the work took anything out of her at all. She caught him looking and straightened immediately, as if embarrassed to show even that small weakness. "He is done," she said, patting the bay's shoulder. "Should carry you wherever you are headed without trouble." James paid her the $2 and took his horse's reins, but he found himself reluctant to leave. "You do good work," he said, and meant it. "I know I do," Margaret replied without a trace of false modesty, and James found himself grinning. "Miss Flynn, would you do me the honor of having dinner with me this evening? There is a restaurant down the street that looks respectable enough." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. McCarran, but I have work to finish before the day is done. Besides, I do not know you." "That is generally what dinner is for," James pointed out, "getting to know someone." "I do not need a man buying me dinner," she said, but there was no hostility in it, just a statement of fact. "I never thought you did," James said quietly. "But maybe I need the company of an interesting woman who is not afraid of hard work. Maybe I just want to spend an hour talking to someone who does not spend the whole time sizing me up for a wedding suit." That got a small smile from her, barely there and gone quickly, but James counted it as a victory. "1 hour," she said finally. "At 6 o'clock. But I pay for my own meal, and if you turn out to be tiresome, I will leave." "That is all I ask," James said, and he meant it. He spent the rest of the afternoon finding a room at the boarding house and cleaning himself up properly, washing away the trail dust and shaving the scruff from his jaw. He told himself it was foolish to go to so much trouble for one dinner with a woman who had made it clear she neither needed nor wanted his attention, but he did it anyway. There was something about Margaret Flynn that had gotten under his skin, something that made him want to know more about her, to understand what made her so fierce and so certain. The restaurant was called the Golden Nugget, and it was the nicest establishment Prescott had to offer, which was not saying much, but at least the floors were swept and the tablecloths were clean. Margaret arrived exactly at 6, wearing a simple dress of dark blue calico instead of her work clothes, her hair still in its practical braid but cleaned of soot. She was not wearing any jewelry or paint on her face, and she looked uncomfortable in the dress, as if she would have preferred to stay in her leather apron. James stood when she entered, and she raised an eyebrow at the courtesy but said nothing as she sat down across from him. They ordered steaks and potatoes, and for a few minutes they ate in silence, both seeming unsure how to begin. "How long have you been working cattle drives?" Margaret asked finally, setting down her fork. "Since I was 15, James said. "That is 11 years now. My father had a small ranch outside of San Antonio, but it was not big enough to support all of us. I was the youngest of 4 boys, so I hired on with a drive heading north and never really stopped moving." "Do you like it? The moving, I mean." James considered that. No one had ever really asked him that before. "I thought I did. It seemed like freedom, never being tied to one place, always seeing something new, but lately—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "Lately it has started to feel less like freedom and more like running from something, though I cannot say what." Margaret nodded slowly, as if that made sense to her. "My father used to say that a rolling stone gathers no moss, but he also said that sometimes the moss is the whole point. Sometimes putting down roots and staying still is the bravest thing a person can do." "Is that why you stayed here, after he passed?" "I stayed because this is my home," Margaret said simply. "Because I am good at what I do, and because I will not be driven out by people who think a woman has no business running a smithy. I stayed because leaving would feel like admitting they were right about me." "Who is they?" "Half the town," she said with a shrug. "The good Christian folks who think I should be married and keeping house instead of working a forge. The men who bring me their business but make jokes about it afterward. The women who cross the street rather than speak to me because they think I am too mannish, too loud, too much." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a matter-of-fact recounting of how things were, but James felt anger kindle in his chest on her behalf anyway. "Then they are all fools," he said firmly. Anyone with eyes can see that you are doing exactly what you are meant to be doing. Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. Why did you really ask me to dinner, Mr. McCarran, James, he corrected. And I asked because I have been on the trail with 30 men for the last 3 months, and not one of them was half as interesting as you are. Because I watched you work today and I saw someone who knows exactly who she is, and that is rarer than gold. Pretty words, Margaret said, but she was smiling now, a real smile that changed her whole face. True words, James countered, though I will admit they are also pretty. They talked through the rest of the meal, and James found himself telling her things he had not told anyone in years. About how he missed his family sometimes, even though he had chosen to leave. About how he loved the work of the drives but hated the violence that sometimes came with them, the way some men seemed to go looking for fights just to prove they were tough. About how he had been saving his pay for years now, thinking vaguely about buying land someday but never quite pulling the trigger on it because that would mean stopping, and stopping felt like failure somehow. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when he finally wound down, she told him about her own life. About learning the smithy work from her father, how he had never treated her differently than he would have a son, teaching her to read metal by its color and sound. About her mother, who had died when Margaret was just 12, leaving her to take over the household duties while still learning the forge. About the loneliness of being different, of not fitting into the neat categories the world wanted to put her in. Do you ever wish you could be different? James asked. More like what people expect, every single day, Margaret said honestly. And then I wake up the next morning and go back to the forge because wishing does not change anything. I am who I am and I will not apologize for it. You should not have to, James said, and he reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment James thought she would pull away, but she did not. Her hand was warm and calloused under his, and he could feel the strength in it, the same strength that had shaped iron and shod horses and built a life on her own terms. They left the restaurant as full dark settled over Prescott, the sky turning deep purple and then black, stars emerging one by one like pinpricks in velvet. James walked Margaret back to the smithy, where she lived in the rooms above the workshop. Thank you for dinner, she said when they reached her door. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I am glad, James said. Can I see you again before I leave town? Margaret hesitated, and he saw the war playing out behind her eyes. Finally she nodded. Tomorrow evening. But just talking, James. I am not looking for anything more than friendship. Understood, James said, though his heart sank a little. But friendship with Margaret Flynn was better than nothing at all. So he touched the brim of his hat and walked back to the boarding house, already counting the hours until he could see her again. The next evening he brought her wildflowers he had picked outside of town, and she had laughed at him but put them in a jar of water on her work table. They walked together through the town, talking about everything and nothing, and James found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The way she gestured with her hands when she was excited about something. The way she tilted her head when she was listening intently. The way she moved through the world with such certainty, as if she had every right to take up space and make noise and be exactly who she was. He stayed in Prescott for a week, then 2, turning down opportunities to join other drives heading north. His money was running low, but he could not bring himself to leave yet. He started taking odd jobs around town, fixing fences and moving cattle, anything to keep himself fed and housed and close to Margaret. She seemed puzzled by his continued presence but not displeased, and slowly, carefully, James felt the walls she had built around herself begin to lower. They fell into a routine. He would come by the smithy in the evenings after she had closed up shop, and they would walk or have dinner or just sit on the bench outside her workshop and talk while the desert air cooled around them. James told her about every place he had ever been, painting word pictures of the wide Texas plains and the mountains of Colorado and the sweeping grasslands of Kansas. Margaret told him about her dreams, the ones she barely admitted to herself. About wanting to expand the business, maybe hire an apprentice, maybe even buy some of the land adjacent to the smithy and build a proper house instead of living above the shop. "Why have you not done it?" James asked one evening when they were sitting outside watching the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. "Money, mostly," Margaret said. "The smithy does well enough to keep me fed and housed, but there is not much left over for expansion. And I suppose I have been waiting to see if the town would accept me, if they would keep bringing me their business, or if it would dry up once the novelty wore off." "It has been 2 years," James pointed out. "I think if they were going to run you out, they would have done it by now." "Maybe," Margaret said, but she sounded uncertain. James wanted to tell her that she was remarkable, that any town would be lucky to have her, but he sensed that she would not believe him, so he kept quiet and just sat beside her, letting his presence speak for itself. One afternoon in his 3rd week in Prescott, James was helping old man Henderson repair a fence on the edge of town when he heard shouting coming from the direction of the smithy. His head snapped up, and without thinking he dropped the hammer he had been using and ran toward the sound, Henderson's startled protests fading behind him. He reached the smithy to find 3 men standing in front of it, all of them clearly drunk despite it being barely past noon. Margaret was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression dangerous. "I told you I am not interested," she was saying, her voice cold and hard. "Now get off my property before I make you regret it." "Come on now, Margaret," one of the men slurred, swaying on his feet. James recognized him as Caleb Stone, one of the ranch hands from the big cattle operation north of town. "Do not be like that. We just want to have a little fun with you. You cannot tell me you do not get lonely working here all by yourself." "What I am is busy," Margaret said. "And you are interfering with my work." "Maybe you need someone to interfere with more than your work," another man said, and the 3 of them laughed, ugly and mean. James felt his hands curl into fists. "The lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them. All 4 heads turned toward him, and he saw Margaret's expression flicker between relief and annoyance. "This is none of your concern, McCarran," Caleb said. "Why do not you go back to wherever you came from?" "Cannot do that," James said, closing the distance between them. He was aware of people stopping on the street to watch, of curtains twitching in windows. "Not when you are bothering Miss Flynn." "We are just having a conversation," the 3rd man said, but he was starting to look nervous, as if he was realizing that this might not go the way they had planned. "No," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You are drunk and stupid, and you are about to get hurt if you do not leave. And just so we are clear, I do not need Mr. McCarran to fight my battles for me." To illustrate her point, she reached into the smithy and came back out with a poker from the forge, still glowing red at the tip. She held it casually, like it weighed nothing, and the 3 men suddenly found themselves backing up very quickly. "Jesus, Margaret, there is no need for that," Caleb said, holding up his hands. "There is every need," Margaret said. "You came onto my property, insulted me, and implied things that would get you horsewhipped if my father were still alive. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to apologize, and then you are going to leave, and if I ever see you around here again when you are drunk, I'm going to tell your boss why I refuse to do any more work for his ranch. Do you understand me?" The men mumbled apologies and stumbled away, nearly falling over each other in their haste to leave. Margaret watched them go, then turned and shoved the poker back into the forge with more force than necessary. James approached carefully, aware that her anger had not dissipated just because the immediate threat was gone. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am fine," Margaret snapped. Then she seemed to hear the harshness in her own voice and softened slightly. "I am sorry. I know you were trying to help, but I meant what I said, James. I do not need rescuing." "I know that," James said. "I saw you. You had the situation handled before I even got here. but that does not mean I am not going to stand by you when trouble comes. That is what friends do." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and some of the fire went out of her eyes, replaced by something gentler. "Is that what we are, friends?" "I hope so," James said, "though I will admit I would like to be more than that if you were willing." "But I will take whatever you are comfortable giving, Margaret. I am not going anywhere." "You are a cowboy," Margaret said, but there was no heat in it. "Cowboys always go somewhere eventually. That is what they do." "Maybe this one is tired of wandering," James said. "Maybe he found something worth staying for." Margaret turned away, and James thought he saw her hands tremble slightly before she shoved them into the pockets of her apron. "Do not say things like that unless you mean them," she said quietly. "I have spent my whole life being strong, being independent, never needing anyone. But that does not mean I do not want things, James. It just means I have learned not to count on getting them." James felt something crack open in his chest at the vulnerability in her voice. He stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the smoke and metal that clung to her, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he had been brave enough. "I mean it," he said, "every word. I know I have only been here 3 weeks, and I know you have no reason to trust that I will stay, but I am asking you to give me a chance to prove it." She turned back to him then, and there were tears standing in her eyes, though she was clearly fighting to keep them from falling. "Why?" she asked. "Why me? You could have any woman you wanted, James. Someone softer, easier, someone who would not argue with you or challenge you or make you work for every inch of ground." "Because I do not want easy," James said. "Because watching you work that forge is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Because you are strong and smart and brave, and you do not need me, Margaret, and that makes me want to be worthy of you anyway. I have spent 11 years running from one place to another, never putting down roots, and I am tired. I am tired of moving, tired of being alone, tired of never mattering to anyone. And then I met you, and for the first time in my life, I want to stay." Margaret made a small sound, half laugh and half sob, and then she was closing the distance between them, and James was pulling her into his arms, and she was crying into his shoulder while he held her, this strong, fierce woman who had been holding herself together for so long. He murmured nonsense into her hair, telling her it was all right, that he had her, that she did not have to be strong every second of every day. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, something open and hopeful. "I am terrified," she admitted. "Of this, of you, of wanting something I might lose." "I know," James said. "I am terrified too. But maybe we can be terrified together." She laughed at that, watery but genuine, and then she was kissing him, her calloused hands coming up to frame his face, and James thought that he would gladly give up every mile he had ever traveled if it meant he could stay right here in this moment forever. They courted properly after that, though Margaret insisted that she was too old and too independent for such things. James brought her flowers and took her to church socials and sat with her in the evenings on the bench outside the smithy. The town watched with interest and some surprise. This wandering cowboy and the blacksmith's daughter who had never shown interest in any man before. James found steady work at the cattle ranch north of town, the same one where Caleb Stone worked, though Caleb gave him a wide berth after the incident at the smithy. The work was hard but good, and James found that he liked having a place to come back to at the end of the day, liked knowing that Margaret would be waiting for him, even if she would never admit that was what she was doing. They had their first real fight 6 weeks after that kiss, over something stupid that James could barely remember afterward. He had suggested that maybe Margaret should hire someone to help with the heavy work at the forge, and she had taken it as him implying she was not strong enough to do it herself. Words were exchanged, voices raised, and Margaret had told him to leave and not come back. James had stormed off, furious and hurt, and spent the night at the bunkhouse with the other ranch hands, stewing in his anger. But by morning, the anger had faded, leaving only the sick feeling of having hurt someone he cared about. He went back to the smithy to apologize, only to find Margaret already waiting for him, clearly having had the same idea. They stood there in the early morning light, both of them stubborn and proud and terrified of admitting weakness, until finally Margaret said, "I am sorry. You were only trying to help and I bit your head off." "I am sorry too," James said. "I should have realized how that would sound to you. I do not think you need help because you are weak, Margaret. I think you need help because you are trying to do the work of 3 people, and that would be hard for anyone." "I know," Margaret said quietly, "and you are right. I have been thinking about hiring an apprentice anyway, someone young who wants to learn the trade. But it is hard to let go, even a little bit. This smithy is all I have of my father, and bringing in someone else feels like I am erasing him somehow." "You could never erase him," James said firmly. "He is in every horseshoe you shape, every piece you forge. Teaching someone else the trade is honoring his memory, not erasing it." Margaret nodded, and when James opened his arms, she stepped into them, letting herself be held. They stood there for a long time, and James realized that this was what love was. Not just the good moments, the kisses and the laughter, but also the fights and the apologies and the choice to stay even when it was hard. Margaret did hire an apprentice eventually, a boy of 16 named Thomas, whose father had died in a mining accident, leaving his family with no income. Thomas was eager and hardworking, and Margaret was a patient teacher, though she pushed him hard. James liked watching them work together, liked seeing Margaret pass on the knowledge her father had given her. As summer turned to fall and fall began to hint at winter, James knew he had to make a decision. The ranch would be cutting back on hands for the winter months, keeping only the essential personnel. He could try to stay on, or he could sign on with another cattle drive heading south for the season, or he could do something else entirely. He talked it over with Margaret one evening in October as they sat wrapped in blankets against the cooling air. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about buying some land. Nothing big, just enough for a small horse breeding operation. I have enough saved up for a down payment, and I could work the ranch part-time while I build it up." "That sounds like a good plan," Margaret said, and there was something careful in her voice, as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I was thinking I might look at some of the land adjacent to the smithy," James continued. "I know you have been wanting to expand, and if we were neighbors, we could help each other out. Share resources, that kind of thing." "Neighbors," Margaret repeated, and he could not quite read her tone. "Unless you would prefer something other than neighbors," James said, his heart hammering in his chest. "Unless you would be willing to consider a different arrangement entirely." Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "What kind of arrangement are you talking about, James McCarran?" James took a deep breath and pulled a small box from his pocket. It was not much, just a simple gold band with a small garnet stone, but it had taken most of his remaining savings, and he hoped it would be enough. "The kind where you would agree to be my wife," he said. "Where we would build that house together, on land that belongs to both of us. Where you could keep running the smithy and I could raise horses and we would have a life together, Margaret. A real life with roots and a future, and everything I never thought I wanted until I met you." Margaret stared at the ring, and for a long, terrible moment James thought she was going to say no, thought he had pushed too hard too fast. But then she was laughing and crying and saying yes, 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 and James was sliding the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then they were kissing, and somewhere in the town a dog barked and someone shouted and life went on around them. But in that moment, the whole world had narrowed to just the two of them. They were married in early December in the little church on the edge of town, with half of Prescott in attendance. Margaret wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself, and James wore his best suit, brushed clean of trail dust. Thomas stood up as James's best man, and the schoolteacher, one of the few women in town who had always been kind to Margaret, stood up for her. The preacher spoke about love and partnership and building a life together. And when it came time for the vows, James promised to stand beside Margaret, not in front of her, to support her dreams as well as his own, to love her strength and never try to diminish it. Margaret promised to let him in, to trust him with her heart even though it scared her, to build something together that would last beyond their lifetimes. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause, and James kissed his bride while the winter sun streamed through the windows, painting everything gold. They bought the land next to the smithy, 20 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it. They spent the winter planning and saving and preparing, and in the spring they broke ground on a house. It was not fancy, just 4 rooms and a porch, but they built it with their own hands, Margaret proving just as skilled with a hammer and nails as she was with forge work. Thomas took over more of the day-to-day work at the smithy, proving himself capable and trustworthy, and that freed Margaret to help with the house and to work on the pieces she really enjoyed, the decorative ironwork and the specialty projects that required more artistry than standard horseshoes. James brought in his first horses in May, 3 mares and a stallion with good bloodlines, and began the slow work of building a breeding program. Their life fell into a rhythm, hard work, and quiet evenings, and the deep satisfaction of building something that would last. They had their disagreements, of course, both of them being stubborn and independent by nature, but they had learned how to fight fair, how to apologize, how to choose each other even when it would be easier to walk away. In the fall of 1879, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told James over dinner, her expression a mixture of joy and terror, and James had picked her up and spun her around the kitchen, laughing like a madman. The pregnancy was hard, Margaret unused to the vulnerability of needing help, of not being able to do all the work she was accustomed to doing. James and Thomas took over more of the forge work, and James hired a woman from town to come in and help with the household tasks that Margaret could no longer manage. Their son was born in April of 1880, during a late spring storm that turned the roads to mud and made the midwife late in arriving. James delivered his own son with shaking hands and Margaret's shouted instructions, and when he placed the squalling, red-faced infant in his wife's arms, he thought his heart might burst from sheer, overwhelming love. They named him John, after Margaret's father, and he had his mother's storm-gray eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Margaret proved to be a fierce and devoted mother, though she went back to working the forge within a month of giving birth, John sleeping in a basket near the anvil while she worked. Some of the town women clucked their tongues at that, but Margaret did not care, and James loved her all the more for it. The years passed in a blur of work and joy and the 1,000 small moments that make up a life. John grew into a sturdy toddler who loved the horses and showed an early fascination with the forge. They had a daughter in 1882, Mary, who was quiet and thoughtful and loved to sit on the porch and watch the sun set. Another son in 1884, William, who was wild and fearless and gave them both gray hairs before he was 3. The horse breeding operation grew slowly but steadily, James earning a reputation for producing sound, steady animals with good temperaments. The smithy continued to thrive under Margaret's leadership, and Thomas eventually brought in his own apprentice, ensuring that the trade would continue into the next generation. James never did go on another cattle drive. There were times, particularly in those first few years, when he would see a crew heading north and feel the old pull, the call of the open trail and the freedom of movement. But then he would look at Margaret, strong and sure and entirely herself, or at their children playing in the yard, or at the house they had built with their own hands, and he knew he had made the right choice. This was freedom too, the freedom of choosing where to be and who to be it with, the freedom of roots instead of wings. On their 10th anniversary, James and Margaret stood on the porch of their house and looked out over the land they had built together. The smithy was thriving, expanded now with a larger forge and a separate workshop for the decorative ironwork that had become Margaret's specialty. The horse pastures were full, 20 head of quality stock that brought buyers from as far away as California. Their 3 children were healthy and happy, John already showing skill at the forge at age 9, Mary proving to have a gift with the horses that rivaled her father's, William still young enough to be wild and free. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked, leaning against James's shoulder. "Giving up the trail life, staying here," James wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Not for one single moment," he said honestly. "I thought I wanted to keep moving, to never be tied down, but I was wrong. What I really wanted was a reason to stay, and you gave me that. You and this life we have built together. You gave me something too," Margaret said quietly. "I spent so long being strong, being independent, proving I did not need anyone, and you loved me for all of that, but you also taught me that needing someone is not weakness. That letting someone in, letting someone help, letting someone love you fully and completely does not make you less. It makes you more." "We make each other more," James said, and he kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her, smoke and metal and soap and home. They stood there as the sun set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of crimson and gold, and watched their children play in the yard of the house they had built on the land they had bought with money they had earned through hard work and determination. Inside, dinner was waiting, a simple meal of stew and bread, but it would be eaten at their own table, surrounded by their family, in a home that was wholly and completely theirs. Margaret's arms were still strong as oak, still capable of shaping iron and shoeing horses and doing any work that needed doing. And James still loved that about her, loved that she did not need him in the desperate, clinging way that some people needed their partners. But somewhere along the way, they had learned that there was a difference between needing and wanting, between dependence and partnership. Margaret did not need James to survive, but she wanted him in her life, chose him every day, and that choice meant more than any amount of neediness ever could. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. There were hard winters and dry summers, years when money was tight and they had to make difficult choices about what to prioritize. There were illnesses and injuries, close calls that reminded them how fragile life could be. There was the year the creek flooded and took out part of the pasture fence, and the year a wildfire came within a mile of their property before the wind shifted and saved them. There was the year John decided he wanted to go east to study engineering, and Margaret cried for a week before admitting she was proud of him for following his own path, even if it took him away from the forge she had imagined him inheriting. But there were also years of plenty, years when the rains came exactly when they were needed, and the horses commanded top prices, and the smithy had more work than they could handle. There were graduations and weddings, first for John, who came back from his studies with a degree and a sweet-faced wife from Boston. Then for Mary, who married a neighboring rancher's son in a ceremony held right there on their land. And finally for William, who surprised everyone by falling in love with Thomas's daughter and asking to take over the smithy operation so Margaret could finally, truly retire. By the time James and Margaret celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1909, they were grandparents 5 times over, with a 6th grandchild on the way. Their hair had gone gray, and their hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but they were still strong, still capable, still choosing each other every single day. They took a trip that year, something they had never done before, leaving the ranch and the smithy in the capable hands of their children, and taking the train east to visit John and his family in Chicago. It was strange and overwhelming, the noise and the crowds and the sheer size of everything, so different from the wide open spaces of Arizona. But it was also wonderful to see John's life, to meet his neighbors and see his work, to understand the world he had built for himself away from the land where he had been raised. On the train ride home, Margaret rested her head on James's shoulder and said, "I am glad we went, but I am also glad to be going home." "Me too," James agreed. "As much as I loved seeing the city, it is not where I belong anymore. Maybe it never was." "Where do you belong then?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Wherever you are," James said simply. That has always been true from the first moment I saw you working that forge. Wherever you are, that is home." They returned to Arizona to find that Mary was managing the horse operation with skill that exceeded even James's own, and that William had already expanded the smithy, bringing in 2 more apprentices and landing a contract to provide ironwork for the new courthouse being built in Phoenix. Their children had taken what James and Margaret had built and made it even stronger, even better, and there was deep satisfaction in that. James and Margaret settled into a gentler rhythm in their later years, still working but no longer driving themselves the way they had when they were young. They spent long evenings on the porch, watching the sun set and talking about everything and nothing, secure in the knowledge of 3 decades spent building a life together. They watched their grandchildren grow, teaching them about horses and metalwork and the value of hard work. They attended church socials and town meetings, and slowly watched Prescott grow from the rough frontier town it had been when they met into a proper city with paved streets and electric lights. On a warm evening in April of 1918, exactly 38 years after their son John had been born, James and Margaret sat on their porch and watched the sun set one more time. James was 70 now, Margaret 62, and they were both feeling the weight of their years, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. "Do you remember the day we met?" James asked, taking Margaret's hand in his. Even now, calloused and age-spotted as they were, her hands were strong, capable of anything. "I remember," Margaret said. "You stood there watching me work, and I thought you were just another cowboy passing through, not worth my time. And I watched you swing that hammer and thought I had never seen anything so beautiful in my entire life," James said. "I knew right then, even though I did not have words for it yet, that you were going to change everything for me." "We changed everything for each other," Margaret corrected gently. "You gave me permission to be strong and vulnerable at the same time. You taught me that independence and partnership were not opposites, that I could have both if I was brave enough to try." "And you taught me what it meant to stay," James said. "To put down roots, to build something that would last. You gave me a home, Margaret, not just a place, but a feeling. The feeling of belonging somewhere, of mattering to someone, of being exactly where I was supposed to be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky went from gold to pink to purple to deepest blue, the first stars beginning to emerge. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. The forge in the smithy was cold for the night, but come morning William would fire it up again, continuing the tradition that Margaret's father had started and that she had carried forward. The horses in the pasture were settling down for the night, and in the house behind them, dinner was waiting, prepared by their daughter-in-law who had insisted on moving in to help as James and Margaret aged. "I would do it all again," Margaret said suddenly. "Every moment, every struggle, every choice. I would do it all exactly the same because it brought me here to this moment with you." "So would I," James said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I spent 11 years wandering before I found you, Margaret, and I would wander for 11 more if that was what it took. You were worth every mile, every moment, every risk." They kissed then, gentle and sweet, the kiss of 2 people who had spent nearly 4 decades learning each other, choosing each other, loving each other. And when they pulled apart, Margaret smiled, that same fierce, beautiful smile that had first captured James's heart all those years ago in a smithy in Prescott, Arizona. "Come on," she said, standing and pulling him to his feet with hands that were still strong as oak, would always be strong as oak, no matter what the years took from them. "Dinner is getting cold and the grandchildren will be wondering where we are." James followed her inside, into the house they had built, filled with the family they had created, and thought that he was the luckiest man who had ever lived. He had set out to wander the world and had instead found everything he never knew he was looking for, all because one day in 1878 he had stopped to watch a blacksmith's daughter work, and she had been strong enough to let him stay. The Wild West had been tamed, The frontier closed, the open range fenced and settled. But in the home of James and Margaret McCarran, in the life they had built together through work and love, and the simple revolutionary act of choosing each other every single day, the true spirit of that wild frontier lived on. Not in violence or lawlessness, but in the courage to build something new, to define yourself on your own terms, to love fiercely and completely without losing yourself in the process. Margaret had been a blacksmith's daughter with arms strong as oak, and James had been a cowboy who loved that she never needed him. But what they had built together was stronger than oak, more enduring than iron, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. And that, in the end, was the greatest love story of all.